Now, let's get back to the big global issue now. And as I mentioned earlier, it's just over an hour now. In less than an hour and a half, Anthony Albanese will be meeting with Xi Jinping. For the first time, an Australian Prime Minister has met with a Chinese leader since Malcolm Turnbull back in 2016. In the best case scenario, the meeting could mark the beginning of the end of trade sanctions that are hurting our exporters. Here's Anthony Albanese speaking on the tarmac in Bali yesterday.
We enter this discussion with goodwill. There are no preconditions on this discussion. I'm looking forward to having constructive dialogue.
Let me bring in Peter Jennings now from Peter Jennings Strategy Consultants. Good to talk to you again, Peter. Tell us what Anthony Albanese should be aiming to get out of this meeting.
His first objective should be no concessions on key Australian strategic interests. You know, Chris, my worry is that China's been using the phrase, let's meet halfway for some time now. But at least according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, halfway means that Xi Jinping consents graciously to a meeting, and then Australia has to walk back all of the decisions that it's taken over a number of years now, for example, to exclude China from our 5G network. Of course, Australia can't afford to do that, and I wouldn't expect Anthony Albanese to do that either. So I think there's going to be a lot of attention, a lot of media hoopla, but at the end of the day, probably no big change to the underlying issues that cause complications in the Australia-China relationship.
Is there anything that Anthony Albanese could reasonably offer, at least in terms of statements and rhetoric, that might allow China to ease back on sanctions without giving ground on any of those key issues that you mentioned?
Well, when you go through the key issues one by one, I think you realise that there is almost no capacity for Albanese to give ground. So really the offer would be more meetings, a willingness to negotiate, a willingness to test if somehow Xi Jinping is moderating his behaviour and is going to become less coercive in his use of economic force against Australia, or less threatening of Taiwan, for example, with military force. I can't see any of those key Chinese objectives changing. And really that means to say that Australian objectives won't change. And frankly, we just shouldn't invest too much hope in the idea of a single meeting. You know, the Europeans meet Putin on a regular basis. There's no change in Russian behaviour. And I doubt very much that we're going to see much in the way of forward movement on Australia-China relations out of this meeting.
Now, what about the trade sanctions? Are they hurting China at all? I'm thinking primarily in coal. Of course, China supplies most of its own coal, but would it be feeling the pinch of not taking Australian coal exports at the moment?
Possibly on cost. It's certainly hurting Chinese consumers over consumer goods like Australian wheat, beef, wine, all of those products which Chinese actually want to use. I think on coal, last northern winter, we saw China seeing significant blackouts across the East Coast, and that will be a risk again unless China continues to buy Australian coal for heating purposes. So yes, China hurts itself when it actually engages in this type of trade sanctions against Australia.
Peter, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.